On June 11, 2026, the Qatari Foreign Ministry announced the terms of a 72-hour ceasefire agreement between Iranian-aligned forces and coalition-backed positions along the southern Iraqi border. The announcement was welcomed by the European Union, acknowledged warmly by the United States State Department, and covered across every major news platform as a critical first step toward de-escalation. The ceasefire held for 68 hours. It was then extended for another 96 hours at Iran's request, with the stated humanitarian justification of opening civilian aid corridors in the affected border region. Hold on to those two numbers, 68 hours, then 96 more. That is 164 hours of continuous ceasefire. Because according to a June 23rd intelligence summary leaked to Reuters and subsequently cited and analyzed by the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps logistics units used that precise window to conduct what the document described as a large-scale dispersal operation of an unspecified high-value asset class from 3 known storage facilities near Bandar Abbas into a network of locations that are not currently identified by Western intelligence. 164 hours. 3 known sites emptied simultaneously. Destination unknown. These two things cannot occupy the same diplomatic frame with the same interpretation. Either the ceasefire was a genuine mechanism of de-escalation entered into by Iran because Iran genuinely wanted less fighting, or those 164 hours were the most operationally valuable time window Iran has obtained in the last 3 years, planned for an advance, executed with precision, and disguised behind a humanitarian justification that nobody in the international diplomatic community could publicly challenge without appearing to oppose aid to civilians. Today, I am going to show you which interpretation the evidence and the operational logic support. Right now, the entire diplomatic and media establishment is asking, will the ceasefire hold? Will it lead to broader negotiations? Is this the beginning of a genuine off-ramp toward a durable reduction in tensions? Those are the wrong questions. Every single one of them. They all share the same foundational assumption that both parties entered the ceasefire for the same reason, which is to reduce the likelihood of continued conflict. That assumption is doing an enormous amount of unexamined analytical work, and it is incorrect. The right question is this. In the documented history of asymmetric conflict and irregular warfare, when has a ceasefire been used most effectively, not as a diplomatic mechanism for reducing violence, but as an operational mechanism for repositioning assets during a window of enforced political immunity? And what does the specific category of asset that just moved tell us about what Iran is actually preparing for next? In the next 20 minutes, I'm going to teach you the framework I call the tactical pause, explain its full operational logic from first principles with a historical anchor that makes the mechanism undeniable, walk you through 5 specific documented indicators that confirm Iran executed this framework with near-perfect discipline during the 164-hour window, identify the most probable specific asset class that was moved, and explain why its disappearance from known locations changes every American and Israeli military planning assumption in the theater, and then name the actor who benefits most from the fact that this asset is now hidden in an unknown and distributed network. The tactical pause framework begins with a structural observation about asymmetric conflict that is so fundamental it should be a starting premise in every analysis of ceasefire agreements involving asymmetric actors. In conventional warfare between broadly symmetric military powers, a ceasefire is a genuine pause in kinetic activity entered into by both sides because both sides have broadly similar reasons to want the pause: to reduce immediate losses, to consolidate positions, to create political space for negotiation toward an outcome both parties can accept. In a symmetric conflict, a ceasefire is what it appears to be. Both sides want the same thing from it. But in asymmetric conflict, where one side possesses conventional military dominance and raw firepower, and the other side possesses distributed, mobility-dependent, irregular capability, a ceasefire has a fundamentally and irreconcilably different value for each party. The conventionally superior side benefits from a ceasefire by preserving assets it cannot easily replace, maintaining favorable battlefield positions, and generating positive political optics stakes domestically and internationally. Those are genuine benefits, and they are real. The asymmetric actor benefits from a ceasefire by something entirely different: movement. Because the asymmetric actor's fundamental strategic vulnerability is not weakness in a firefight, it is the visibility of its high-value assets at known, mappable, targetable locations. A ceasefire is the one operational condition under which the conventionally superior power cannot execute a preemptive strike against those known locations without shattering the political framework it publicly endorsed and the diplomatic relationships it relied on to construct. A ceasefire is not a pause in the war for an asymmetric actor. It is a window of political immunity. And a sophisticated asymmetric actor does not use that window to rest. It uses that window to move everything that would be struck the moment the ceasefire ends. Think about what happens in a chess match when the grandmaster, who appears to be operating under pressure, is offered a draw. A novice in a difficult position accepts the draw to escape. But what if the grandmaster, who understands the position at 20, moves deeper than the novice can see, uses the moment of the draw negotiation to complete a repositioning move that places his most powerful piece on a square from which the novice cannot identify the threat it now poses? The draw offer has not been accepted as a peace proposal. It has been used as a cover for the most important move of the game. The draw offer is not a peace proposal. It is a misdirection. The move that happens during the misdirection is the actual strategic event. The historical anchor for this framework is the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, specifically the dynamics of the October 22nd UN ceasefire. In the first phase of the war, Egyptian forces executed a genuinely surprising canal crossing and established positions on the eastern bank of the Suez Canal that shocked Israeli military command and reversed the previous strategic disposition of the theater. When the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 338 on October 22nd, calling for an immediate ceasefire, both the Egyptian and Israeli governments publicly committed to observing it. But within hours of the ceasefire's announced start, Israeli commanders on the southern front, recognizing that the ceasefire window was giving Egyptian forces uncontested time to consolidate and reinforce their bridge positions on the eastern bank, made the documented decision to continue limited offensive advances designed to encircle and cut off the Egyptian Third Army before the ceasefire could solidify into a permanent and favorable Egyptian position. The ceasefire was being used by both sides simultaneously as a diplomatic event and as a tactical repositioning opportunity. Neither side was being irrational. Both sides were applying the same logical framework. Use the pause to improve your position before the pause becomes permanent. The ceasefire did not stop the conflict. It channeled the conflict into a different form for 160 hours. Iran studied 1973 in detail, not as history, as a template. Now the evidence. There are 5 documented indicators that the tactical pause framework was executed with deliberate precision during the 164-hour ceasefire window that ended this week. 5 indicators, not 1 or 2 suggestive data points. 5 observable, attributed, and cross-corroborated indicators. Number 1, the 6-hour initiation timeline. According to the Reuters leak and the subsequent analysis by the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, the IRGC logistics movement began within approximately 6 hours of the formal ceasefire announcement. Not 6 days, not 6 weeks, 6 hours. Consider what that timeline means operationally and what it rules out analytically. A logistics operation involving the dispersal of high-value assets from 3 separate storage facilities simultaneously across an uncertain number of destination locations, requiring transport vehicle coordination, security escort planning, destination site preparation, and communications management to keep the operation coordinated without creating an observable electronic signature, does not begin executing within 6 hours of a ceasefire announcement unless every element of that operation was pre-planned, pre-positioned, and pre-staged before the ceasefire was announced. The trucks were already loaded. The routes were already planned and security assessed. The destination sites were already prepared and ready to receive the assets. The drivers and security personnel were already briefed and positioned. The only missing element was the ceasefire itself, which provided the 6-hour window of observation-free movement that the operation required to begin. The ceasefire was not the cause of the decision to move the assets. The decision to move the assets was a prior strategic commitment. The ceasefire was the missing operational precondition that the strategic commitment was waiting for. The sequence runs exactly backwards from what the diplomatic framing implies. Iran agreed to the ceasefire in part because the ceasefire solved an operational logistics problem Iran had already identified and planned for. Number 2, the simultaneous evacuation of 3 known sites. The intelligence summary reported 3 known storage facilities near Bandar Abbas. Known. These were locations that Western intelligence services had identified, had been monitoring with collection assets, and had presumably included in pre-planned strike packages for any scenario involving offensive action against Iranian military infrastructure. Moving assets from one known site while leaving 2 others intact is a manageable and observable operation that an adversary can partially counter by striking the remaining 2 before they can be evacuated. Moving from all 3 known sites simultaneously during a window when strikes are politically foreclosed by a ceasefire the international community is publicly supporting, eliminates the adversary's option to strike the remaining sites before they are emptied. 3 sites. Simultaneously, during the specific and only available window when strikes were off the operational table. That operational design does not emerge from opportunism. It emerges from deliberate and specific operational planning that identified the simultaneous multiple site evacuation as the optimal tactical solution to the vulnerability problem of having high-value assets at known and monitored locations. Number 3, the destination unknown classification. The intelligence summary, as reported by Reuters, used the specific phrase, network of locations not currently identified by Western intelligence. That phrase is operationally significant in a way that deserves careful attention. It tells us that the assets were not moved to a different known facility, which would simply transfer the targeting vulnerability from one location to another, while creating a detectable pattern of movement that collection assets could follow. The assets were dispersed into a new distribution architecture, consisting of locations that have not yet been identified by Western collection systems. This is the same operational logic as the dormant mesh applied to physical assets rather than human networks. A single high-value asset stored at a single known location is a target. The coordinates are known. The strike can be planned. The same asset distributed across 15 unknown locations of varying size and type across a large geographic area is a targeting problem of an entirely different and dramatically higher order of difficulty. You cannot strike 15 locations you cannot find. The asset is not simply moved to a safer location. It has been transformed from a single findable target into a distributed and currently unfindable network. The asset is not better hidden. It has been made plural, which is fundamentally different from being hidden. Number 4, the asset category logic. The intelligence summary described the moved items as a high-value asset class without specification, which is consistent with standard practice in publicly cited intelligence reporting that is designed to avoid identifying collection methods and sources. But the combination of 3 observable contextual factors narrows the probable asset category significantly. The Bandar Abbas storage location is geographically and institutionally associated with IRGC naval and maritime weapon systems. The scale of the logistics operation, involving multiple transport vehicles across 3 separate sites over more than 6 days, is consistent with assets of significant physical size or quantity. And the timing correlation with the June 2026 Hormuz exercise is not coincidental. The exercise demonstrated the IRGC's tri-vector anti-ship saturation capability and the specific asset category that would most directly enable that capability at dispersed forward positions is the subsurface and semi-submersible drone platform inventory and its associated launch, guidance, and communication support equipment. Naval analysts at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, writing in 2025 assessments, identified this specific asset class as Iran's highest operational priority for dispersal in any pre-conflict or active conflict scenario, precisely because it is the category of capability that, if destroyed at a known location by a preemptive strike, would most significantly degrade Iran's ability to execute the tri-vector anti-carrier saturation it demonstrated in June. Moving it first, before anything else, during the only window of political immunity available, reflects a precise and accurate understanding of what American and Israeli strike planners would target first if the ceasefire ended and military options became available. Number 5. The extension timing correlation. The original ceasefire was negotiated for 72 hours. On the second day of the ceasefire, Iran submitted a request through Qatari mediators to extend it for an additional 96 hours, citing humanitarian access requirements for civilian aid corridors in the affected border region. The humanitarian justification is a legitimate stated reason that cannot be publicly contested without appearing to oppose aid, access to civilian populations, which makes it both diplomatically effective and essentially impossible for any international actor to challenge publicly. But examine the operational timing of the extension request. If a complex multi-site logistics dispersal operation begins within 6 hours of ceasefire initiation, and the operation requires coordinated movement across multiple locations with security considerations that necessitate careful pacing to avoid creating observable patterns, the total operational window required to complete the movement safely is approximately 140 to 160 hours. The original 72-hour ceasefire was insufficient. The extension to 164 total hours was the precise duration required to complete the operation with adequate margin. The extension request was submitted at the midpoint of the dispersal operation. The humanitarian justification was the wrapper. The operational requirement was the content inside the wrapper. Now, I want to give you the strongest, honest counter-argument because you need it, and it has genuine analytical force. The counter-argument runs as follows. Iran routinely moves military assets as a matter of standard operational security practice in an environment where it correctly assesses that American and Israeli intelligence services are continuously monitoring its known military sites. This movement requires no special ceasefire explanation and is consistent with the ordinary operational security behavior of any military operating under the threat of potential preemptive strikes. The intelligence summary's description of the moved assets as unspecified means that the identification of them as subsurface drone platforms is an analytical inference rather than a confirmed fact. The ceasefire extension is equally and perhaps more simply explained as a genuine diplomatic development driven by Qatar's interest in demonstrating its mediation effectiveness and the genuine complexity of establishing humanitarian corridors in active conflict zones. Qatar has significant credibility as a regional mediator and would not allow its mediation role to be used as an operational cover for Iranian military repositioning without substantial damage to the bilateral relationship and its regional standing. And the destination unknown designation may reflect the current limits of Western intelligence collection capability in the Bandar Abbas area rather than the successful implementation of a sophisticated distributed dispersal network. Those are fair-grounded and intellectually serious objections. But here's what the counter-argument cannot explain. It cannot explain the 6-hour initiation timeline, which is operationally inconsistent with routine asset rotation and operationally consistent only with a pre-planned operation that was staging on the ceasefire as its activation trigger. Routine operational security movements do not begin within 6 hours of a ceasefire announcement because they are not scheduled around ceasefire announcements. Pre-planned ceasefire exploitation operations are. It cannot explain why all 3 known sites were evacuated simultaneously rather than sequentially. Routine rotation empties and refills sites on staggered schedules. Simultaneous triple site evacuation during a specific time-bounded window is consistent only with an operation specific designed to exploit that window completely before it closes. And it cannot explain the correlation between the total duration of the extended ceasefire and the operational timeline of a complex multi-site dispersal operation. 3 separate correlations, each individually arguable as coincidence, all 3 appearing together, point away from coincidence with a combined probability that the coincidence interpretation cannot comfortably absorb. Let me bring this together. The tactical pause is the most effective strategic tool available to an asymmetric actor operating against a conventionally superior adversary who possesses the ability to strike known targets with precision. It is effective precisely because it is invisible to analysts who who evaluate ceasefires exclusively through a diplomatic lens and who assume that both parties enter a ceasefire for symmetrically similar reasons. Iran entered this ceasefire not to de-escalate, but to solve a specific and pre-identified operational logistics problem, moving its most valuable and most targetable asset category out of known, monitored, pre-planned strike locations into a distributed and unidentifiable network of positions before any American, Israeli, or coalition strike could execute against them. The 5 indicators we examined together constitute a coherent picture of one pre-planned operation executed with near-perfect discipline during a 164-hour window of enforced political immunity. The ceasefire is over, the window has closed. The asset is now distributed across a network that Western intelligence cannot currently map. And every military strike planning package that was built against the Bandar Abbas facilities is now targeting empty warehouses. And now the actor that nobody in this conversation is discussing, not Iran, not the United States, not Qatar, China. China is observing every aspect of this ceasefire dynamic with concentrated attention focused on one specific analytical question. How does an asymmetric actor successfully use a diplomatic pause mechanism to improve its military position without triggering a military response from a conventionally superior adversary that could have prevented the repositioning? Because China is actively planning for scenarios in the Taiwan Strait in which a diplomatic pause, whether a negotiated ceasefire, a UN-requested stand-down, or a mutually agreed humanitarian pause, might create the same kind of operational window that Iran just exploited. If Iran's tactical pause succeeds, meaning if the dispersed assets cannot be relocated by Western intelligence, and if Iran emerges from the ceasefire period with its most valuable anti-access capabilities, now hidden in an unknown distributed network, China has a validated real-world template for doing exactly the same thing at far larger scale in the Pacific, a template for using international diplomatic frameworks as operational shields, for dispersing high-value assets during windows of political immunity, for converting a peace mechanism into a military repositioning mechanism without the adversary being able to respond because the adversary publicly endorsed the mechanism. The patient giant is not watching this ceasefire because it cares about the specific outcome of the Iraq border conflict.